They said the galaxy had no reason to fear a human until one refused to step aside. The air inside Docking Hall 12 tasted like overheated circuitry and recycled oxygen, dry enough to sting the back of Ethan Cole's throat with every breath he took. And the low hum of the station's failing gravity grid vibrated faintly through the soles of his boots, as if the entire structure was holding itself together out of habit rather than design. And Ethan stood there in a pressed but aging security uniform that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders anymore, a badge clipped slightly, crooked to his chest. A man who made barely $12 an hour keeping peace in a place that had long forgotten what peace even meant, watching as the grandest wedding procession he had ever seen move through the corridor like a living constellation of light and color. Alien dignitaries in shimmering fabrics that caught the station's pale glow and fractured it into colors he didn't have names for. Their voices layered in tones both melodic and sharp, speaking in languages his translator struggled to keep up with. And at the center of it all, quiet, still, almost unnaturally so, was her, the bride, Lyra Veyna. Her skin reflecting a soft blue sheen like moonlight across water, her posture straight but not proud, her hands bound not by visible restraints, but by something heavier, something unspoken, something that made Ethan's chest tighten without him fully understanding why. And as he watched her pass, escorted by armored guards whose polished suits whispered with every step, he noticed the smallest detail that no one else seemed to care about. The way her eyes didn't scan the crowd, didn't acknowledge the grandeur, didn't even flicker with fear, but instead stayed fixed forward as if she had already accepted an ending no one else could see. And someone near Ethan laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound, muttering something about political necessity and alliances, words that felt too clean for the weight they carried. And Ethan shifted his stance, adjusting his grip on the standard issue pulse baton at his side, telling himself this wasn't his problem, that his job was to keep the hallway clear, not to question why a bride looked more like a prisoner than a partner. But then, just for a second, her gaze moved, barely, almost imperceptibly, and met his, and in that single moment, everything slowed. The hum of the station fading, the voices dulling into distant echoes, and there was something in her eyes that didn't ask for help, didn't beg, didn't demand, but simply existed, raw and undeniable, a quiet truth that slipped past every rule Ethan had learned to live by. And he swallowed, feeling the dry scrape in his throat again, his mind already forming excuses, reasons to look away, reasons to stay in line, reasons to let the galaxy continue exactly as it was. And yet his feet didn't move. His hands didn't relax, and somewhere deep inside him, something stubborn and human refused to stay silent. Because for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole wasn't just watching a ceremony. He was witnessing a choice, and he had the sinking feeling that whatever he decided next, the galaxy would remember it. The corridor did not feel the same after that glance, as if the recycled air itself had shifted temperature by a few degrees, colder in the lungs, heavier in the chest, and Ethan Cole found himself still standing in the exact spot long after the procession had passed, the echo of soft ceremonial music lingering like a ghost in the metal ribs of Docking Hall 12, his fingers tightening unconsciously around the grip of his baton as his mind replayed that single moment over and over again. The way her eyes had met his not with panic, but with something far more dangerous, a quiet acceptance that did not belong in a place filled with celebration lights and diplomatic smiles, and his training whispered at him to move, to return to his post, to log the event and forget it like every other strange thing that happened on this station. But his body did not listen, because something about her still lingered in the space around him like static electricity before a storm, and then the calm. Unit clipped to his shoulder crackled to life with a sharp burst of feedback that made him flinch, a supervisor's voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority, instructing all personnel to clear the upper passageways and prepare for restricted access protocols, reminding them in clipped, emotionless tones that the bride was classified as high value and not to be approached under any circumstances. And Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his jaw as if he could wipe away the tension building there. High value. That was what they called her. Not a person, not a woman, not even a guest, just a designation wrapped in procedure. And he pushed himself off the wall, finally moving, boots echoing in a steady rhythm as he followed the corridor toward the central atrium where the ceremony would take place. Each step feeling heavier than the last as the station lights flickered faintly overhead. The power grid struggling under the strain of so many systems running at once, casting brief shadows that stretched and shrank like something alive. And when he reached the observation threshold overlooking the atrium, he stopped again, drawn forward by a pull he could not quite explain. And below him the scene unfolded in precise, calculated perfection, rows of alien officials standing in formation, their garments shimmering in layers of gold and violet. A raised platform at the center where the officiant waited beside a towering figure clad in ceremonial armor that reflected the light like polished stone. The groom, Ethan assumed, though the man did not move, did not shift, did not even seem to breathe in a way that felt human. And then Lyra was guided forward, her steps measured, her posture flawless. Yet there was a slight delay in each movement, a fraction of a second that made it clear she was following expectation rather than desire. And Ethan leaned his forearms against the railing without realizing it, his gaze fixed on her as the distance between them stretched to nearly 50 yards, too far to hear anything clearly, yet somehow close enough that he could still see the faint shimmer of her skin under the artificial light, still see the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides, as if holding on to something invisible. And a thought formed in his mind, simple and unwelcome. What if she does not want this? And it should have ended there, should have been dismissed like every other passing doubt. But instead it settled deeper, rooting itself in the part of him that had once believed rules existed to protect people, not to control them. And as the officiant raised a hand to begin the ritual, Ethan felt his pulse slow instead of quicken, a strange calm replacing the noise in his head, the kind of calm that only came before a decision he could not take back. And somewhere beneath the hum of the station, beneath the distant voices and the shifting lights, he realized that for the first time since taking this job, he was not thinking about protocol, or paychecks, or consequences. He was thinking about one thing only, whether standing still would make him part of something he could never justify. And that thought alone was enough to make his next breath feel heavier than all the ones before it. The officiant's voice carried across the atrium in smooth, measured tones, translated into a dozen languages through the station's overhead speakers, each word precise, ceremonial, empty, and Ethan Cole felt it more than he heard it, a low vibration in his chest that did not belong to him, as if the entire station had decided this moment mattered more than anything else. And below him Lyra Veyna stood perfectly still beneath the wash of white light, her blue skin catching reflections from the surrounding crystal pillars, turning her into something almost unreal, like a figure carved from light rather than flesh. And the groom shifted slightly beside her, the polished plates of his ceremonial armor whispering together with a sound that reminded Ethan of cold metal dragged across glass, controlled, deliberate, absolute. And Ethan's grip tightened on the railing as he watched the distance between them shrink, not physically but in meaning, in inevitability, each second pulling her closer to something she had not chosen. And the words from the comm unit echoed again in his memory. High value, restricted access, do not interfere. And for a moment he tried to hold on to them, tried to let them anchor him in something familiar, something safe. But they slipped through his mind like water, because nothing about what he was seeing felt like safety. And then it happened again, so small it could have been imagined. Lyra's gaze shifted, just slightly, not searching, not scanning, but finding. And somehow, across nearly 50 yards of open space and layered security, she found him again. And this time there was something different in her eyes, not acceptance, not resignation, but a question, quiet and impossible, one that did not belong in a ceremony designed to remove all uncertainty. And Ethan felt his heartbeat change, not faster, but deeper, each pulse landing heavier than the last, as if his body was trying to warn him that what he was about to consider would not fit inside the life he had built here. And he straightened slowly, pulling himself away from the railing, the metal cool against his palms as he let go, the sound of the ceremony continuing without pause, because of course it would. The galaxy did not stop for doubt. It did not pause for second thoughts. It moved forward, always, and people like Ethan were supposed to move with it, not against it. And yet his feet carried him toward the access stairwell before he had fully decided to go, each step deliberate, measured, the hum of the station growing louder as he descended, the air warmer here, thicker, filled with the scent of ozone and distant machinery. And as he reached the lower-level corridor that led directly toward the atrium floor, a pair of security officers stood at the checkpoint, their uniforms cleaner than his, their posture rigid with protocol. And one of them glanced at him with mild surprise, as if trying to place why a mid-level guard would be approaching during a restricted ceremony, and Ethan slowed, just enough to make it look intentional, just enough to buy himself a second to think. But the truth was already there, settled in his chest like something immovable, because the question in her eyes had not asked for permission, it had not offered him an easy way out, it had simply existed. And now he had to decide whether he was the kind of man who could pretend he had never seen it, or the kind who would step forward knowing exactly what it might cost. And as the officer opened his mouth to speak, to ask for clearance or identification or a reason that fit inside the rules of this place, Ethan realized that whatever he said next would not just be an answer, it would be a line he could never step back across. The officer's question never fully left his lips before Ethan Cole answered it. Not with words, but with motion, a subtle shift forward that carried him past the invisible boundary between observation and involvement. And for a fraction of a second the other man hesitated, not because Ethan had authority, but because he moved like someone who believed he did, and in places like this belief often passed for clearance. The corridor lights reflecting faintly off the polished floor as Ethan stepped through the checkpoint with measured calm, his heartbeat steady now, not racing, not uncertain, just present in a way that made everything else feel quieter, sharper, more real. And behind him, he could feel the pause, the unspoken question forming between the two officers as they decided whether to stop him, whether to challenge something that did not quite fit. But protocol had a weakness. It depended on confidence, and Ethan did not look like a man asking for permission. He looked like a man carrying it. And by the time doubt caught up to them, he was already moving down the final corridor toward the atrium floor, the hum of the station rising around him, deeper here, layered with the soft resonance of energy barriers and environmental regulators working overtime to maintain the delicate balance required for so many species in one place. And as the passage opened up, the sound of the ceremony became clearer, the officiant's voice weaving through the air in rhythmic patterns that felt more like a script than a meaning. And Ethan stepped out onto the perimeter of the atrium, his boots making almost no sound against the smooth surface as he moved along the edge, close enough now to see details that had been lost from above, the fine lines of tension in Lyra's posture, the faint tremor in her fingers as she held them still at her sides, the way the light caught in her eyes not as a reflection, but as something held back. And the groom turned slightly, acknowledging her presence with a gesture that was precise and distant, as if he were interacting with an object rather than a person. And something in Ethan's chest tightened again, not sudden, not sharp, but steady, like pressure building behind a sealed door. And the officiant raised both hands, signaling the final phase of the ritual, a sequence of words that would bind more than two individuals, that would lock decisions into place where they could not be undone. And Ethan slowed his steps, feeling the weight of that moment settle over him, because this was the point where everything would become irreversible, not just for her, but for him as well. And he could still stop, he could still turn back, blend into the perimeter, let the ceremony finish, and convince himself that he had imagined. The question in her eyes, that it had meant nothing, that it was not his place to answer it. And for a brief second that path almost made sense. It offered safety, stability, a return to the quiet life he understood. But then Lyra moved again, barely, a shift of her head, a breath that seemed to catch before it fully formed. And her gaze found him once more, closer now, clearer, and whatever distance had existed between them before was gone, replaced by something immediate and undeniable. And Ethan felt it land in him with the kind of certainty that did not require explanation, because some things did not need words, they only needed to be seen. And as the officiant began the final declaration, Ethan Cole took one more step forward, crossing from the edge of the crowd into the space where he was no longer just a witness, but a part of whatever came next. The moment his boot crossed that invisible line, the entire atmosphere of the atrium shifted in a way no announcement could explain. as if the station itself registered that something was out of place, something small but impossible to ignore, and Ethan Cole felt it immediately, a subtle tightening in the air, a change in how the nearby guards adjusted their stance, not reacting yet, but noticing, and still he kept walking, each step measured, unhurried, his posture straight, not out of confidence, but because hesitation would have broken the fragile illusion that allowed him to be here at all. And the officiant's voice continued without interruption, smooth and practiced, guiding the ceremony toward its final binding words. But now there was a faint ripple beneath it, a shift in attention as more eyes turned, as more minds tried to understand why a human station guard was moving toward the center of a ritual that had no place for him. And Ethan did not look at them. He did not look at the armored groom whose presence loomed like a wall of polished authority. He looked only at her, at Lyra Veyna, who stood in the center of it all like the still point in a storm. And as the distance between them closed to less than 20 feet, he saw something he had not been able to see before, not just the tension, not just the restraint, but the exhaustion beneath it, the quiet weight of someone who had already accepted too many decisions made for her. And something in his chest settled into place with a clarity that erased the last of his doubt. Because whatever this moment was supposed to be, it was not right, and that was enough. And a guard to his left finally stepped forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to signal that the boundary had been crossed. A hand lifting slightly, as if to guide Ethan back to where he belonged. And Ethan slowed, not stopping, but acknowledging the movement with a brief glance that held no challenge. Only certainty, and for a second that seemed to be enough, because uncertainty was contagious, and the guard hesitated, just long enough for Ethan to take another step, and then another, until he stood within 10 feet of the platform, close enough now that the officiant's voice was no longer filtered through speakers but carried directly through the air, the words precise and binding, describing unity, alliance, permanence, concepts that felt heavy and irreversible. And Lyra's gaze did not leave him, not even as the final phrase approached, not even as the entire room seemed to lean toward that single moment of completion, and Ethan drew in a slow breath, the dry air scraping his lungs, grounding him in something real, something human, and he realized that he did not need a plan, did not need authority or permission or a reason that would satisfy anyone else in this room, because the truth was simpler than all of that. It had been there from the moment she looked at him, and as the officiant lifted his hands to seal the ritual, Ethan Cole took the final step forward and spoke, his voice steady, not loud, but clear enough to cut through the ceremony in a way that silence could not. And in that instant the entire atrium held its breath, because one human, with nothing but a choice, had just done something the galaxy did not expect. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, not the guards, not the officiant, not even the distant shimmer of light along the crystalline pillars, as if the entire station had paused to process a single human voice interrupting something that was never meant to be interrupted, and Ethan Cole felt the weight of that silence settle around him like pressure in deep water, steady and undeniable. Yet he did not step back, did not correct himself, because the words had already left him and they were simple, almost disarmingly so. Does she choose this? And it was not a challenge, not an accusation, just a question placed into a space where questions were not supposed to exist, and the effect was immediate in the way only truth could be, subtle but irreversible. The officiant's hands hovering mid-gesture as his composed expression flickered for the briefest moment, not with anger but with uncertainty, because the script he followed did not include deviation, and around them the gathered dignitaries shifted almost imperceptibly, the quiet rustle of fabric and movement carrying more tension than any raised voice could, and one of the nearby guards stepped forward again, this time more certain, his posture firmer, as if the structure of protocol had finally caught up with what was happening. But even he hesitated just before speaking. Because Ethan was not acting like a threat, he was standing like someone asking for something that should already have been given, and Lyra Veyna remained still at the center of it all. Yet the stillness had changed. It was no longer resignation, no longer passive. It was focused, alive in a way that had not been there before, and her eyes stayed on Ethan as if the rest of the room had faded away, as if the countless witnesses and the towering figure beside her no longer mattered in the same way. And Ethan could feel it, that fragile shift, like the moment before ice begins to crack, not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to reverse once it starts. And the officiant finally lowered his hands, slowly, carefully, choosing his next words with a precision that felt different now, less certain, more aware, asking in a controlled tone whether there was a concern to be addressed, framing the interruption as procedural rather than personal. And Ethan nodded once, a small movement, grounding himself in the reality of what he was doing, because this was no longer just about a feeling. It was about giving that feeling space to exist, and he did not raise his voice, did not demand attention. He simply spoke again, clearer this time. You are about to bind her to something permanent, so ask her. And the simplicity of it cut deeper than any argument could have, because it forced the moment to turn, to face the one person who had been treated as an outcome rather than a participant. And for a second longer the room resisted, the weight of expectation pressing down, the silent insistence that things continue as planned, that nothing change. But then something unexpected happened, not from Ethan, not from the guards, but from Lyra herself. A breath drawn that seemed to carry more than air, her shoulders lifting slightly, as if she were reclaiming something that had been taken piece by piece. And when she spoke, her voice was soft but steady, carrying clearly through the atrium without the need for amplification. No. And it was not loud, not defiant, just honest. And that honesty moved through the room like a ripple across still water, touching every corner, every observer, every unspoken assumption, and Ethan felt it land in him with a quiet certainty. Not relief, not victory, but recognition, because this had never been about stopping something. It had been about allowing a choice to exist, and now that it had been spoken, nothing in this room could return to what it was before. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because it had never been expected to exist in this space. And Ethan Cole felt it settle into every corner of the atrium, like a quiet fracture spreading through something that had once seemed unbreakable. And for a moment no one spoke, not the officiant, not the guards, not even the towering groom whose presence had dominated the room only seconds before, because no was not part of the script. It was not something that could be processed through protocol or translated into a diplomatic adjustment. It was something far more disruptive, something human. And Lyra Veyna stood there with her shoulders no longer weighed down by invisible restraint, but lifted just slightly, as if that single word had given her back something she had almost forgotten she owned. And Ethan did not move, did not step closer, did not try to guide or shield her, because this moment was not his to take, it was hers to hold. And all he had done was make space for it to exist. And the officiant finally lowered his hands completely, his expression composed but no longer certain, recalculating, searching for a path that could restore order without acknowledging that control had already slipped. And one of the senior guards took a half step forward, his voice measured as he addressed the situation in terms of clarification, of procedure, asking Lyra to confirm her statement as if repetition might soften its meaning. But she did not hesitate this time, did not look away, her gaze steady and clear as she repeated it. No, I do not. And the difference between the two words and the full sentence was subtle but undeniable. It was not just a response, it was a declaration, and the ripple moved again, deeper now, spreading through the gathered officials whose quiet whispers began to rise beneath the surface, not loud enough to disrupt, but strong enough to signal that something had shifted beyond repair. And Ethan felt the attention turn toward him then, not all at once, but in waves. I was trying to understand how a single human had altered the direction of a ceremony designed to resist exactly this kind of disruption, and he did not meet those gazes, did not acknowledge the weight of them, because if he did he might remember everything he stood to lose, the job, the place, the fragile stability he had built for himself in a galaxy that rarely made room for people like him. And instead he kept his focus on Lyra, on the steadiness returning to her posture, on the way her hands no longer curled inward but relaxed at her sides. And for the first time since he had seen her, she looked present, fully there, not a figure moving through expectation but a person standing inside her own choice. And that was when the groom finally moved, not abruptly, not with force, but with a controlled shift that drew attention back to him, the subtle sound of his armor aligning as he turned his head toward Ethan, then toward Lyra. and though his expression was difficult to read beneath the reflective surface, there was something in the stillness that followed. Something calculating, something aware that the balance of this moment had changed in a way that could not be ignored, and the silence that returned was no longer empty. It was filled with consequence, with the understanding that what had just happened would not remain contained within this room, that it would move outward, carried through channels and reports and whispered accounts. And Ethan Cole stood in the center of it without raising a hand, without issuing a command, knowing that whatever came next would not be decided by power alone, but by the simple, undeniable fact that someone had been given a choice and had chosen for herself. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like pressure redistributing through a sealed structure, and Ethan Cole felt it in the way the air seemed heavier now, charged with something that no longer belonged to ceremony, but to consequence. And the groom took a single step forward, measured, deliberate, the soft alignment of his armor carrying across the atrium with a quiet authority that demanded attention without raising a voice. And when he spoke, it was not loud, not aggressive, but controlled in a way that suggested centuries of being obeyed without question. His words directed first to the officiant, then to Lyra, as if Ethan were not yet worth acknowledgement, framing her refusal as confusion, as stress, as something that could be corrected if given the proper guidance. And Ethan recognized the pattern immediately, not from politics or diplomacy, but from something simpler. The way people tried to reshape truth into something manageable, something that fit their expectations. And for a moment, it almost worked, the room leaning toward that explanation, toward the comfort of restoring order. But Lyra did not move back into that space. She did not lower her gaze or soften her stance. Instead, she stepped forward, just one step, but enough to change her position from where she had been placed to where she chose to stand. And that movement carried more weight than any argument could, because it was not reactive, it was intentional, and Ethan felt something shift again, not in the room this time, but in himself, a quiet realization that this was no longer about interrupting a moment. It was about standing inside it with her, not ahead of her, not instead of her, but with her. And the guards along the perimeter adjusted subtly, their formation tightening, not aggressive but ready, their training pulling them toward containment, toward restoring the controlled environment they were responsible for maintaining. And Ethan could feel their attention, narrowing, calculating, deciding whether he was a disruption to be removed or a variable to be managed. And he did not reach for his baton, did not raise his hands. He simply remained where he was, grounded, present, his posture open in a way that did not challenge but did not yield either. And the officiant cleared his throat softly, attempting to regain control of the narrative, suggesting a brief pause to clarify the bride's position in private, to remove her from the public eye where the situation could be resolved without further complication. And the suggestion hung there, reasonable on the surface, structured, safe, a way to contain what had already begun to spread. And for a second the room seemed to accept it, to lean toward that solution. But Lyra's gaze shifted again, not searching this time, but choosing, and she looked directly at Ethan, not asking, not questioning, simply acknowledging. And then she turned back to the officiant and spoke with a steadiness that carried further than any raised voice. There is nothing to clarify. And the words settled into the space with a finality that closed the door on every attempt to reframe what had already been made clear. And Ethan felt the weight of that land not just on the room, but on the unseen networks beyond it. Because something like this would not remain contained. It would move. It would be recorded, repeated, analyzed. And somewhere out there people who had never heard his name would begin to learn it for reasons he had not planned. And the groom finally turned his full attention toward Ethan then, the reflective surface of his armor catching the light in a way that made his expression impossible to read. But the stillness in that moment said enough, because the balance of control had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Ethan Cole stood there without armor, without authority, without anything but the simple act of refusing to look away, realizing that whatever happened next would not be defined by strength or rank, but by who was willing to stand when it mattered most. The weight of the moment did not explode. It deepened, settling into every surface of the atrium like a quiet gravity that pulled attention inward, and Ethan Cole could feel it in the way no one moved to speak immediately. No one rushed to restore order, because something fundamental had shifted, and even those trained to control situations like this were recalculating what control meant now. And the groom remained still for several seconds longer than anyone expected, his gaze fixed on Ethan with a kind of measured stillness that felt less like anger and more like assessment, as if he were encountering something unfamiliar and trying to decide whether it was insignificant or dangerous. And Ethan held that gaze without challenge, without defiance, simply present, because there was nothing he needed to prove in that moment, only something he refused to abandon. And beside him Lyra Veyna stood with a steadiness that had grown stronger with each passing second, her posture no longer shaped by expectation but by intention, and the distance between them had changed in a way that could not be measured in feet or yards. It was no longer the space between a guard and a bride. It was the space between two people who had chosen to stand in the same truth. And the groom finally spoke again, his tone calm but edged with something colder now, addressing the room rather than either of them directly, reframing the interruption as a misunderstanding of cultural protocol, emphasizing that agreements of this magnitude were not subject to individual hesitation, that they represented the will of entire systems, entire civilizations. And his words carried weight, not just because of who he was, but because of the structure behind them, the unseen networks of authority that reinforced every sentence. And for a moment Ethan felt the pressure of that, the enormity of what stood against them, not in the form of threat, but in the form of inevitability, the quiet insistence that some things were too large to be altered by a single choice. And he understood then why most people stepped back in moments like this, why they convinced themselves that it was not their place. Because the alternative required standing against something that did not even acknowledge your right to exist within its decision. And yet Lyra did not step back, did not soften. And when she spoke again, her voice carried not just clarity, but something deeper, something that did not seek approval. Then your systems should have asked me sooner. And the simplicity of it cut through the groom's reasoning in a way that argument could not, because it exposed the absence at the center of everything, the missing consent that no amount of structure could replace. And the ripple that followed was quieter than before, but far more profound, because now it was not just a disruption, it was a contradiction, a visible flaw in something that had presented itself as flawless. And Ethan saw it in the faces around them, the subtle shift in posture, the hesitation in the eyes of those who had arrived expecting certainty and were now confronted with something they could not easily dismiss. And he realized then that fear did not come from power alone. It came from unpredictability, from the presence of something that did not follow the expected pattern. And in that moment he was no longer just a guard who had stepped out of line. He was an unknown variable inside a system that relied on predictability to function, and the realization settled over him with a strange kind of calm, because it meant that what he had done mattered in a way he had not intended, but could no longer ignore. And as the groom's attention returned fully to him, no longer dismissive, no longer indirect, Ethan understood that whatever came next would not be about restoring the ceremony. It would be about addressing the disruption he represented. And for the first time since stepping forward, he allowed himself a single, steady breath, grounding himself in the simple truth that had carried him this far, that he had not acted to challenge the galaxy, only to stand beside someone who had been given no choice, and somehow, that had been enough to change everything. The air did not move, but something in it tightened, like a system reaching its limit without yet failing. And Ethan Cole felt that tension settle across his shoulders, not as fear, not as panic, but as awareness, the kind that came when a moment could no longer be undone. And across from him the groom shifted his stance by less than an inch, yet the entire atrium seemed to adjust with him, attention narrowing, focus sharpening, because now the situation had been recognized for what it was, not a misunderstanding, not a delay, but a deviation that required response. And when he spoke this time, his voice carried a subtle change, still calm, still controlled, but no longer distant. It was directed, precise, aimed at Ethan in a way that acknowledged him fully for the first time. You are not part of this agreement. And the statement landed without force, without emphasis, yet it carried the weight of systems far beyond this room. Centuries of structure condensed into a single sentence meant to define the boundaries of relevance. And Ethan felt it. The attempt to reduce him, to place him back into a role that could be dismissed, ignored, removed without consequence. And for a brief second he understood how easy it would be to accept that, to step back, to let the machinery of the galaxy resume its motion without him in its way, because nothing in his life had prepared him to stand against something this vast, this certain, and yet the thought passed as quickly as it came, because standing here had never been about belonging. It had been about refusing to leave, and he answered not with argument, not with challenge, but with something simpler, something that did not try to match the scale of what stood before him. Neither is she, if she does not choose it. And the words did not rise in volume, did not demand attention. They existed plainly, and that was what made them impossible to dismiss, because they did not try to overpower the moment. They clarified it. And for the first time the groom did not respond immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to reveal that the structure behind him did not have a ready answer for something so direct. And around them the gathered officials had grown completely still, not out of obedience but out of something closer to uncertainty, because the foundation of the ceremony had shifted from inevitability to question, and questions did not follow the same rules, and Lyra stood beside Ethan now, not behind him, not separated, her presence aligned with his in a way that felt natural rather than arranged, and the light that reflected across her skin seemed steadier, less fractured, as if the act of choosing had grounded her in a way the ceremony never could, and Ethan became aware of the guards again, their formation tightening further along the perimeter, subtle movements that suggested preparation rather than reaction, not aggression but containment, as if the situation was being assessed for the moment when it might need to be controlled more directly. And he understood what that meant without needing to see it unfold, understood that whatever happened next would not remain at the level of words alone. And yet he did not step back, did not shift his weight, because the decision had already been made long before this point. In the moment he chose to walk forward instead of away, and now all that remained was to stand inside it fully, without hesitation, and as the groom finally inclined his head slightly, not in acknowledgement, but in calculation, Ethan realized that the question was no longer whether the ceremony would continue, but what the galaxy would do when it could not ignore a choice that had been made in front of everyone. And in that realization there was no triumph, no sense of victory, only a quiet understanding that some lines, once crossed, did not lead back to where they began. It did not happen all at once, the shift, but Ethan Cole felt it the same way you feel a storm before it breaks, in the subtle tightening of space, in the way the guards along the perimeter no longer adjusted casually, but moved with quiet precision, forming lines that were no longer ceremonial but deliberate, and the hum of the station deepened, as if systems beneath the surface were being redirected, attention shifting from celebration to control, and for the first time since he stepped forward, Ethan understood that the moment had moved beyond words into something that would demand a response the galaxy was more comfortable with, structure, containment, resolution, and yet no command had been given, no order spoken aloud, because even now there was hesitation, not from weakness but from uncertainty, because this situation did not fit the patterns they were trained to handle, and the groom remained where he stood, still as polished stone, but his silence was no longer empty, it was watching, calculating, weighing the cost of every possible next move, and beside Ethan, Lyra Veyna drew a slow breath, steady and controlled, as if she were preparing not to react but to decide, and that difference mattered, because reaction belonged to fear, but decision belonged to ownership. And when she stepped forward again, closing the last few feet between herself and the open space of the atrium floor, it was not a retreat from the structure behind her. It was a movement into something unknown, something unscripted, and Ethan did not reach for her, did not guide her. He simply matched her pace by remaining exactly where he was, grounded, present, offering nothing but the certainty that he would not step away. And the officiant finally spoke again, his voice carefully controlled, suggesting that the ceremony be formally suspended pending review, the language precise, diplomatic, designed to preserve dignity while acknowledging disruption. But even as he said it, it was clear that the decision was no longer his to define, because the attention of the entire room had shifted, not to the platform, not to the groom, but to the space between Ethan and Lyra, where something far simpler and far more dangerous was taking shape, a shared understanding that did not rely on authority or agreement, and Ethan felt it settle into him with a clarity that removed the last trace of doubt. Because whatever came next, whatever systems activated or decisions were made beyond these walls, the choice had already been claimed, and it could not be unspoken. And then the groom moved again, just enough to draw focus, stepping down from the platform with measured control, each motion deliberate, not rushed, not reactive, and when he stopped several feet from them, the distance felt intentional, as if he were acknowledging that this was no longer a position he could simply close, and his voice, when it came, carried a new tone, still composed, still authoritative, but no longer dismissive. You understand what this refusal disrupts? And it was not a question, not entirely, but it invited one, and Lyra met his gaze without lowering hers, her voice steady as she answered, yes, and there was no apology in it, no hesitation, just recognition of consequence, and Ethan felt that answer more than he heard it, because it meant she was not stepping away from what this would cost. She was stepping into it fully, and something about that settled him in a way nothing else could, because this was no longer about intervening, it was about standing beside someone who had chosen to face the weight of her own decision. And the room held that moment in complete stillness, because for the first time, the galaxy was not watching power decide. It was watching choice refuse to be overridden, and no one yet knew what to do with that. No alarms sounded, no weapons were raised, and that was what made it feel unreal, because Ethan Cole had expected the galaxy to respond with force, with something loud and immediate, but instead it answered with silence, a deeper kind than before, one that carried weight. And in that silence something invisible shifted beyond the walls of the station, systems recalibrating, observers recording, decisions forming in places Ethan would never see. And he felt it without understanding how, like pressure changing before a storm breaks across a distant horizon, and the groom's gaze remained fixed on Lyra Veyna for a long moment, longer than any exchange of power required, as if he were searching for something that had been missing from the equation all along. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, not weaker, but stripped of the certainty that had defined it before. Then you accept the consequences that follow. And Lyra did not hesitate, did not look to Ethan for reassurance, did not soften the edges of her choice. She simply nodded once, a small motion that carried more finality than any declaration. And in that moment Ethan understood something he had not fully seen before, that this was not about him saving her, not about stepping in as a protector in the way the galaxy might frame it later. This was about her standing in her own decision and him refusing to let that decision be erased. And the distinction settled into him with a clarity that grounded everything else, because it meant he was not leading this moment. He was holding space for it. And that was enough. And the officiant stepped back slowly, lowering his hands completely now, no longer attempting to guide the outcome, because there was nothing left to formalize, no ritual that could contain what had already happened. And along the perimeter the guards did not advance, did not close in, but their formation shifted again, widening rather than tightening, as if the space itself was being redefined, no longer a controlled stage, but an open ground where something unpredictable had taken root. And Ethan noticed it in the smallest details, the way one guard lowered his hand from his comm unit, the way another adjusted his stance not toward containment, but observation. And it struck him then that fear did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it appeared as hesitation, as the refusal to act without certainty. And that was what had entered the room. Not panic, not chaos, but the realization that a single human, with no authority, no rank, and no claim to power, had introduced something the galaxy did not know how to measure. And Lyra took one more step, not away from the groom, not toward the exit, but toward Ethan, closing the final distance between them until they stood side by side without separation. And she did not reach for him, did not cling or lean. She simply stood there, aligned, present, and Ethan felt that more than any gesture could have conveyed, because it was not dependence, it was choice. And somewhere beyond the station walls, beyond the silent fleets and the unseen watchers, that choice would be interpreted, debated, feared, and remembered in ways neither of them could control. But here, in this moment, it was simple, undeniable, and complete. And as the groom finally turned away, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of something he could not override, The entire atrium seemed to release a breath it had been holding since the first word had broken the ceremony. And Ethan Cole remained exactly where he was, not victorious, not triumphant, just standing, realizing that he had not changed the galaxy with strength or force, but with something far quieter, something that could not be commanded or contained, the simple act of refusing to look away when it mattered most. No one announced the end of the ceremony, but everyone understood it had already happened, not in a moment of sound or spectacle, but in the quiet space where expectation had been replaced by something far more fragile and far more powerful. And Ethan Cole stood there beside Lyra Veyna, as the light from the atrium ceiling shifted slowly across the polished floor, catching on the edges of abandoned ritual objects and unmoving figures who no longer knew what role they were supposed to play. And the hum of the station returned gradually, not as background noise, but as something grounding, something real, like breath returning after being held too long. And Ethan became aware of his own body again, the weight of his boots, the dryness in his throat, the faint tremor in his hands that he had not noticed before, and he let out a slow breath without realizing he had been holding it, because the moment had passed, and yet nothing. Felt resolved, not in the way endings were supposed to feel, and Lyra did not move away, did not step forward toward any exit or authority. She remained where she was, her presence steady, her gaze no longer searching or questioning, but simply present, as if for the first time she was allowed to exist without direction. And Ethan glanced at her then, not to check, not to confirm, but because something in him needed to understand what came after a choice like that. And she met his eyes without hesitation, and there was no fear there, no uncertainty, only a quiet clarity that felt almost unfamiliar in a place like this. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to explain, nothing to justify, and the silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had just been decided, and around them the gathered officials began to shift, slowly at first, then with more purpose. Conversations forming in low voices, movements guided not by ceremony but by necessity, because something would have to be done, reports filed, decisions made, consequences defined, and Ethan knew he would be part of that whether he wanted to be or not, because his name would already be moving through channels he had never seen, attached to a moment that would not stay contained within this room. And yet standing there, he did not feel like someone who had changed anything grand or irreversible. He felt like someone who had simply refused to let something wrong continue, without question, and somehow that had been enough. And Lyra turned her gaze outward then, looking not at the groom who had stepped away, not at the officials or the guards, but at the open space of the atrium itself, as if she were seeing it for the first time without the weight of expectation shaping it. And her voice, when it came, was quiet, almost lost beneath the returning hum of the station. What happens now? And it was not directed at him alone, not entirely. It was a question asked, into the space they now shared, into a future that had not been written for them. And Ethan considered it for a moment, not searching for the right answer, because there was none, not yet, and he shook his head slightly, a small, honest gesture that carried more truth than certainty ever could, we find out. And the simplicity of it settled between them without resistance, because that was all there was left, not a path defined by others, not a role assigned by systems, just the unknown shaped by choices they would have to continue making. And as the light above shifted again, casting long reflections across the floor that stretched toward the edges of the room, Ethan Cole remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just standing beside her in the quiet aftermath of something the galaxy would not forget, not because of power or force or victory, but because in a place built on certainty, someone had chosen, and someone had stayed, and that had been enough to make everything else hesitate.